The one scary bit of all this is if, in retrospect, you look back over the rhetoric and the policy of the last 25 years, and I mean this in a very non-partisan sense, how often have we held out hope for people that hasn't been realised, or fooled ourselves that by talking to ourselves we solved something? Well, very often is the answer to that. And in some ways the current financial constraints create the opportunity where we all know that we can't waste time and resource on that. In times of plenty, you can. Now we can't. And so we owe it to those people who are depending on us to not give them hope that can't be realised or fool ourselves by talking to ourselves. So those are features of the government's policy thinking: longer term change, strong focus on the person rather than the structures and the funding around them, the belief that every community has a resource that amounts to a solution to the problem that they are trying to deal with, and responsibility that is shared. If we can't share it, they won't. Now, I just want to run you quickly through a few examples, and there are a number, but just two in particular, which I'm familiar with just because as the finance guy, I spend a lot of time interacting with ministers and officials driven by a combination of financial objectives, but also alongside that, in fact intertwined with it, the government's larger social objectives. We aren't trying to solve every problem, and I don't think you would expect us to, but we have picked out some areas where which are going to be quite a focus for the next 4 or 5 years. The first is what we loosely call the law and order pipeline. One of the first things I was told as a new Minister of Finance was that we had to build several thousand new prison beds. And as the representing an electorate that is the proud owner of one of our newest prisons, the Wellington prison, and having spent a bit of time in and out of there, in my political capacity. Well, sometimes you do have to dip into the local culture. Prisons are a fiscal and moral failure, and building more of them on a large scale is something I don't think any New Zealander wants to see. They want a safer community, and they want protected from the worst elements of criminal behaviour, but they don't want to be a prison colony. And the law and order pipeline was work started by the previous government, who grappled with the number of the same issues, and that is very fast rising costs. It's the fastest rising cost in government in the last decade, and fast rising demand for prison beds, which are $250,000 a pop, capital plus $90,000 a year to operate. And my view is we shouldn't build any more of them. So the government has picked up this analysis and pushed it very hard, and it's all about understanding exactly what happens from the time a 17-year-old who had a bit much to drink encounters the police through to the time they end up with a 15-year sentence, a very expensive guest of Her Majesty's government. And it turns out that process is full of decisions made without understanding the implications, costs that could be reduced or avoided, inefficiencies that waste money but also invoke disrespect. If we don't treat young people with the respect of an efficient system, why should they have any respect for it? And they don't. And it's giving us the capacity to look at how we can apply resources in different steps along the pipeline, from the police through the courts and into the corrections or other sentencing system. And we hope that over the next few years we'll be able to make significant progress. Already some progress has been made. Simply having officials understand how all the bits are connected, and an awareness a very simple awareness that they make decisions that have an impact further down the pipeline for that individual has led to the fact, for instance, that we don't have to build the second remand wing at Mount Eden Prison, because we've made the remand system more efficient. The community is just as safe as it was, but we will have less people spending less time in the limbo of remand. So you can expect to hear a lot more about that, because we, for instance, had a very interesting policy discussion in the context of the public-private partnership tender round about what recidivism is, because we want to put financial incentives on the operators of the new prison to reduce recidivism. And when they've probed about what that is, we found we weren't that sure, actually, initially, how we counted it, what we meant by it, what was success, what was failure. Even if that PPP doesn't go ahead, we've learned an awful lot from having to answer someone else's questions about what we're trying to achieve in our prisons. The second framework that we're going to be using for quite some time is around long-term welfare, and this is taking a view about which at its core uses financial cost as a proxy for and measure of the social cost of long-term dependency. You'll be familiar with the work of the Welfare Working Group. The government will pick up some of its recommendations, and some of it won't pick up because we think they went a bit far in some places. But the core concept is pretty simple. If you take what ACC, the group of people ACC classify as long-term claimants, there's about 12,000 of them. And there's a whole structure built around preventing people from becoming long-term claimants because we know literally the financial costs if people do become long-term claimants, and considerable resource invested in supporting people with severe accident problems to make sure they don't get worse. A sort of rough approximation of that group in the welfare system is more than 10 times larger. So in ACC it's about 12,000. In welfare it's about 170,000 people. That is a lot of people having miserable lives. We don't do anything with them. The simple example, 25-year-old male goes off to the doctor because they've got depression. They get that diagnosis, they're on the sickness benefit. In 3 months' time they're sitting in their damp flat, their Sky subscriptions run out, they've lost all their mates, they've got limited capacity or motivation to find work. Not too much longer, they're on the invalid's benefit. The main reason you leave the invalid's benefit is that you die or you go on national super. And that's statistically factual. I'm not exaggerating. That's not good enough when there's so many of them, when this economy needs more capable people, when the demographics are moving against us with more older people. Of course, they'll work longer, but it does mean that the success and capacity of every young person becomes increasingly important to us. So we need a framework that gets around the Treasury and the Minister of Finance, who by habit will say, no, we're not spending anything on those people because it costs money, it's expensive. We need to be able to apply the insurance type framework, which says if you leave them there, it's going to cost you this much. Therefore, you can afford, in fact, you're incentivised to apply some resources to that 25-year-old now so they don't end up costing you $200,000 because they're on the invalid's benefit for 15 years. The current liability, at a rough guess, of that 170,000 people is around 50 billion. So and that's just a rough guess because no one's had a good crack at it. We don't really understand that population, actually. We've been measuring them in superficial and tangential ways for 30 years, but we really do not understand them. And that in itself is a testimony to a large waste of money on policy and analysis. But there was no good reason to. Now that we think there's 50 billion of avoidable cost, and who knows how much avoidable misery, then we have some pretty profound incentives. Now, it's not to say we know all the answers. I'll just use that example along with the other to demonstrate that we've got some longer-term policy frameworks with the features that I talked about earlier, and we will be working with anyone who can help us in that mode of thinking. And of course, you are leaders in that environment. Can I finish with just one last point? The Commissioner covered a number of very good points, I thought, but he left one out, and that's a bit of courage. I'm not sure what it is, but there's something about the way government has worked with people that makes them less brave than we know they can be. And if I can give you one example, we set up a fund last year, despite the fact that we've headed for New Zealand's largest ever deficit, to promote, encourage innovation in the non-government sector. And many of you will know my friend and colleague Paula Bennett, who's a remarkable minister, I must say, and she has unusually said, well, if it's not innovation, I'm not going to give out the money. And 9 months later, we've given out almost nothing. Because while people talk about how they want change, they are reluctant, for reasons we all understand, to make change in how they do things themselves. It's all about the government should change. Well, the government is changing, and I think Minister Bennett has demonstrated that. She wrote the first high trust contract herself because the officials wouldn't do it. They were too scared to. So she did it over the weekend. And now that's spreading. And that is about a better relationship, but more importantly about better decision making for people who actually need some quality decisions in their lives, because sometimes they don't make that good decisions themselves. So the government is willing to change. We're willing to be challenged, but we're not being challenged enough. We're not getting enough people kicking the door down saying, you can do this really differently, and here's how I'm going to contribute, and here's how you can contribute. We do get some coming along saying, you could really change things, but don't ask me to take too much part in it, because I would have to go back to my committee and explain to them that the way we do things is going to change. So please, come and scare us. That would be really good. We're not sitting there with a whole box of solutions we think that you should implement. We're sitting there with some reasonably loose frameworks that are inviting challenge. We have had a significant challenge there from the Honourable Tariana Turia. An intense and at times tedious discussion over whānau ora for 18 months. And the government has taken the risk of committing resource to what has already turned out to be something which the Maori community feels like it owns for the first time in a generation, maybe 2 generations. That in itself, that sense of responsibility, is about 30% of the solution, even before it's done anything. And we've taken that risk in the plain light of day. With considerable resources, because in the end the case was pretty compelling that what we were doing wasn't making any damn difference. So maybe we should try something else. That has been our biggest challenge. So please, by the end of the day, come with some more. Thank you.